Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Thanks for joining us again. We hope you enjoyed our preliminary brief last time. This time, we're going to get into a little bit more depth. We're going to be talking about chapters 1 through 4 of Charles Eisenstein's wonderful new book, The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible. So I'm Jeremy Stuart, and I'm joined here by Scott Noelle again. And good to see you, Scott.
Good to see you again, Jeremy.
So good. It was really nice for me to review these 4 chapters. I've read the whole book now, and but it was great to go back and revisit them, especially because these first 4 chapters, I think, really set the tone for the whole book. And I actually got a lot more out of it by reading it again, doing a second reading. So I want to talk a little bit about what stood out for me in particular about these 4 chapters, and then you can jump in and we'll hear from you too.
Yeah, I think it's what I like about this format of doing it as a discussion and including other people is that it really you read it differently when you know that you're reading it with other people,
Right.
and you really want to sort of crystallize the most impactful points. And I had a hard time limiting myself because it seems like every paragraph has something really impactful. But what I really want to share with everyone is those points that really impacted me and brought out insights into my own life experience.
Yeah, likewise. I mean, I feel like there's so much in there. It's really hard to. I wrote lots and lots and lots of notes down, and then tried to boil it down to something coherent. There's just so much in this book. It's really incredible. And what's going to be interesting, I think, for us is hearing other people's perceptions of how the book resonates for them, and that's going to be really exciting. I think everyone's going to get something different out of it. So, if you like, I'll just jump in, and we'll talk a little bit about the first chapter, which is this idea of separation, and the fact that the old story, the old world story that I sort of grew up with is very much in keeping with what Charles outlines in the book. Everything was pretty much kind of fine, even though we had problems in my own family, and there were problems in the world around me. There was a certain kind of innocence to my experience growing up. It's interesting too because I think that the era that I grew up in, the sort of late '60s, early '70s, overall there was sort of more of an innocence to the world. We weren't so bombarded with news media all the time, and so had instant access to all of these colossal disasters that are happening around the world and stuff. And so I kind of wonder, just collectively, if there's been a loss of innocence overall, and that we're just more bombarded and aware of everything that's happening in the world. But anyway, in my own personal experience, everything was kind of moving along pretty well. I never really questioned much about my upbringing until I became a teenager and kind of left home and escaped the kind of clutches of my family and really entered the world. And then I started to really question like what was going on. I mean, the first thing was the fact that my dad had the same job for about 20 years and was totally miserable because of it.
Wow.
And that brought into stark focus for me that I didn't want to buy into that story. That was something I definitely did not want to do. I looked at him and said, okay, there's something wrong with that picture. What am I going to do about it? What am I going to do differently? And I started questioning everything, my relationship to work, and then who I was as a person, what my role in the world was going to be, how I wanted to live my life. And those questions sort of became the foundation for kind of my young adult life. And what's interesting to me is that for a while I was able to really kind of maintain those questions. They were very, prominent and prevalent in my psyche on a daily basis. And it wasn't until I sort of hit my early 20s when it became really difficult to kind of hold on to those ideals. And that somehow that story of the world was pulling me in. It was very difficult to break free. When I was a teenager, just like, yeah, I'm going to break free of all that. I'm not going to live that way, the way my parents lived. I'm going to do something different. And then when I hit my early 20s, all of a sudden, that sort of pull of the old story started to really take a hold, and I was kind of sucked right back into that. And that's interesting to me because it says so much about how ingrained this story is in our culture and how much pressure there is to kind of conform to it. So,
What would
luckily,
you say are some examples of how you got sucked into the story?
well, just the idea. I was a musician, and I wanted to just sort of be free and play music, and live my life in a free way. And all of a sudden, then the idea of like, well, you got to get a proper job and make an income, and what about getting married and raising a family and owning a house, and all of this, all of this sort of layers and layers and layers of things that we're supposed to do started to kind of come up, and and many of those I, of course, ended up doing. But what's cool is that those questions really didn't go away. They just kind of went underground, and they've always been with me, and they've popped up in various points during my life. When I got divorced from my first marriage, those questions were just hitting me right in the face again. Okay, what am I doing? Am I happy doing this? Why am I doing this? Should I be doing something different? The pull to the new story became more dominant, even though I was entrenched in the old story, and I had to make some adjustments to kind of change the way I was living. But those questions again, get buried. I think we're sort of bombarded by what's around us, and it's only recently again that they've sort of come up for me, having turned 50, and I'm entering the second stage of my life that I call Life 2.0. So those questions are now becoming more prevalent again, and I think especially now that as a society we're sort of constantly bombarded by all these messages about the world that we know. This system is kind of breaking down around us, and we have to do something about it.
Yeah. Do you remember when you first had that feeling that something is wrong?
Yeah, and I think I was about 16, 17 when I really started to kind of pay attention. And for me, it first happened when I was in school, just with some of the things they were telling me I quote unquote had to do.
Yeah.
So, well, why do I have to do that? Why can't I do something different? That was my first indication that something wasn't quite right. That I wasn't in control of my destiny or my life, and that other people were sort of making choices for me that didn't really fit who I was.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I left home and about 18 years old and never really went back. And at that point, everything came into question.
Wow. I think for me, it started when I was a toddler. I mean, I really had, I was very introspective from the very beginning, and I was fortunate to have kind of progressive parents who were not really particularly punitive and controlling. So I experienced the contrast very early of this sort of orientation on separation and control, just by through my peers, and the way they were treated by their parents, and I couldn't make sense of it, And I had bought into the story of the kind of the Leave It to Beaver that he really talks about in the beginning of chapter 1, and it seemed it seemed nice. And if you think about all those old TV programs, the parents weren't particularly mean, but in real life, children were always afraid of being beaten by their, and today we would, I call it beaten, they call it spanking, but it's a beating.
Yeah.
And so parenting was really what impacted me, that feeling that something is wrong. And like you, school, it was interesting for me to read what Charles said about how this feeling of wrongness originates in school for many people, because for me that happened later, and I think it was because I was bright and I did well in school. Mm-hmm. And so I didn't really question it, because even though it's an insidiously terrible game, this the way school is set up to create winners and losers, I was winning,
Right.
And so it's like, well, I guess it's okay, and something's wrong with everyone else. But it wasn't until later I realized that form of winning was really a loss, because of how it separated me from my peers.
Right. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Yeah, I mean, I didn't get that sense with school until I was in my teens, till high school, really. I sort of just followed along and did what everybody was supposed to do until I got to high school, and then suddenly they started slamming doors in my face. And at that point, I woke up and said, "Okay, I want no part of this." So that was the first part of the story that came unraveled for me. And then it's interesting too, though, that so the idea of the sort of in chapter 2, he talks about breakdown, and I think it's very hard to kind of stay focused and to stay on on a new path when you're sort of faced with the idea that everything around you could be a fraudulent, could be breaking down, and how do you forge that path? As I said, for me, I sort of maintained this direction towards a new path for a certain amount of time, and then I felt like I got kind of pulled back into the old story. It's really hard, I think, to forge an independent story in the midst of all of this noise around us, and I think it's also very uncomfortable for some people when you start really questioning the things in your life and the way you're living your life. You start really bringing into question what you're doing. A lot of uncomfortableness comes up around that, and some people can't handle that. I like how Charles described it as, the place between one story and the next story, or the new story, is like wandering naked in the wilderness. and yet it's an incredibly sacred place, because it has that potential for carving out something new and stepping into something new. But it's a very hard place to really maintain. And so, that was my experience. I sort of tried to carve out my new space, and then felt afraid and kind of at odds with what was happening around me, and being pulled into that story over and over again. So, and yet, always being drawn to wanting to be in that place of not really knowing and like trying to figure out what's next. There's something compelling about that.
I found, I was thinking about, when was my personal breakdown? And I think it was when I was 19 and I dropped out of college. But I think ultimately, I guess there was a brief period of pain for me, but then it was quite liberating to realize that I was in a story that wasn't mine. And that's really when I became an unschooler. I've told this story before about saying, I don't need authorities to tell me what I need to learn or how or where my life should go, and that I realized I was, I wasn't in college for the reason I said I was, and I'm sorry, for any authentic reason, and so I just said, screw it. I know how to learn. I know what is meaningful to me, what is important to me, and I can forge my own path. And so for me, that breakdown was relatively short. And then once the light went on, I felt very liberated.
Right.
And excited about the adventure of being between the stories. I think if you've had I guess part of that for me was because my parents were always kind of between stories. And so it was a little more comfortable place to go for me. Like there was, I mean, in some ways it was insecure, but because we didn't have the Leave It to Beaver existence. We didn't own our own house. We didn't go on family vacations, and we were kind of poor. But I would, and so but somehow life was okay during my childhood. So when I decided I wasn't going to go for the old story and try to get the degree and the job and the Brady Bunch house, all those things that had been laid before me as the ultimate success. It was just like, well, now what do we get to do? We get to create something. I imagine you felt similarly when you stepped into being a musician.
Yeah, somewhat. I mean, it's interesting. My parents were definitely part of the old story, you know, for sure. I mean, very entrenched in that, and I never really felt I belonged in that. You know, I think my breakdown came when I actually got married when I was very young. I got married at 22, the first time round, and divorced at 32. And so at that point, that's really where my breakdown happened, where everything came into question. You know, why I owned a house, you know, I had the mortgage and, you know, the job and all this stuff, and I was just miserable, totally miserable. Like nothing's working here. I don't know what I'm doing, who I am, where I'm going. And so I got rid of all of it. I got rid of the marriage, got rid of the house, got rid of most of my stuff, and I moved to a tiny little room at a Zen center up in the mountains. And my parents said to me, "What are you running away from?" And I said to them, I remember very clearly, I said to them, I said, "I'm not running away. I'm walking towards my home."
Wow.
And that was a really powerful moment for me because it was, like you said, very liberating to finally realize, okay, I'm taking on my own story here, and it doesn't look like anything you expect. And I'm just going to forge ahead regardless. You know, and so that was sort of my really waking up moment. You know, I said that those questions had kind of gone underground, I think, when I was in my 20s, and then they resurfaced when I hit, you know, I hit 30 and really came into focus again. So as they're coming into focus again now.
Wow. I'm also recalling that I had I'd say that the breakdown happened in two phases for me. So the first is the one I described, but the second really was in between 1995 and 2001 when I started, or right about the time that I started parenthood, and just before my wife got pregnant, were we were both reading books like Ishmael from Daniel Quinn. And it took it to a new level for us. So it wasn't just about my personal story, but it was about the whole story of humanity. And so we started reading things that gave us a broader perspective about this idea of the story is not just one person's life story; it's the story of humanity, and that there are very different stories one can inhabit. Anyone who is not familiar with Daniel Quinn's work, I'm sure it must have influenced Charles, or else they're just tuned into the same wisdom. But really looking at how humanity lived for thousands, hundreds of thousands of years prior to civilization, in which this this story of separation really came into into the forefront of human existence, and prior to that, it was really, and I think that's why Charles calls it a reunion, because it's not something new, it's it's the recovery of something old that is a deeper part of our humanity, that we lived for most of human evolution in a story of interbeing. And so when you look at these old cultures that still live that way, it teaches you something about your humanity. So it was Daniel Quinn, and then later Gene Liedloff, the continuum concept, that really put it into high gear for me. That I wanted I was curious about how we collectively could move into a new story.
Right, right. Yeah, and that's the big question. You know, I love what you said there about it's not something new. It's like we're recovering or reclaiming something old or something that we've forgotten, that we're out of touch with, and yet we still feel it. I mean, I feel it. I think we all, on some level, feel those kind of pangs of wanting to reconnect to something deeper, and we're aware that there's something deeper in there. That sense of interbeing is there all the time. Most of the time, I think we're not paying attention to it. We're bombarded and busy and distracted and everything else. But if you really sit down quietly and reflect for a few minutes, I think most people would agree that they can sense that there's that stream of interbeing that's still there. And so how do we dip our toe back in, or put our foot in, or just jump in to that interbeingness? You know, I mean, it's clear that that's where we need to be operating from if we're going to make any lasting change at all. And, you know, and it has to start on an individual level. we have to first of all fully understand that we are operating from that place. So it's a much more real place, and and then collectively that needs to take a hold. That idea that we are connected to everything. I mean, it's impossible, I think, to make any difference at all to yourself or to anyone around you or the world around you if you are continually operating from that place of separation.
Right. And then toward the end of chapter 2, Charles talks about, I use the word assimilation, of how you start to awaken, but then somehow the old story kind of assimilates these echoes of the new story, and almost trivializes certain things, but I really appreciate the point he's saying, that we're in a particular time now where the moments of awakening are coming faster and faster,
yeah,
and more, so that there's not time for this assimilation to occur, mm-hmm. and that's sort of what gives me hope for the that we're not just going to keep taking the blue pill, to make a Matrix reference. Mm-hmm. That we can't really avoid the red pill anymore, and we need to go into this new reality.
Right, right. But again, so as he says in chapter 4, when you start talking about cynicism, that cynicism is sort of always present, and he talks about it as kind of a wounding that has to heal. And I was thinking a lot about that too. I mean, in terms of my own cynicism, when I sort of call into question the news story and become cynical of what I'm trying to walk towards or move towards, for me, I think a lot of it is connected to desire. In the those are my deepest desires, is to live a more fulfilling, rewarding life that helps other people and makes a difference in the world. And when I think on some fundamental level, I'm terrified of my deepest desires, because they might not work out. They might let me down. It might not turn out to be what I thought it was going to be. And so I think that sort of stops me from really trusting it. I think trust comes into this a lot, like really trusting that intuitive sense that, okay, I get the feeling that something's wrong and I need to change and be more interconnected and live from a more authentic place. But there's this cynical self-doubt that kind of comes up about, well, yeah, but it might not work out, and then what? After you've pulled the rug out, what are you standing on? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think we're all born with that stance. I mean, it's a solid ground that we're born on, because it's in our humanity. But then you look at, particularly if you watch mainstream parent-child interactions, you really see how children who are just being authentic and being true to their humanity are betrayed by their parents, and often well-meaning parents just trying to help them, that make sure their children will thrive in the story that we all live in. Mm-hmm. But I think that's where we lose that trust. I think you're born trusting life, and and when life moves through you in glorious ways, as they do in 2- and 3-year-olds, and then you get quashed. You lose it, and you develop this kind of defendedness, which, as an older person, expresses as cynicism.
Right. That's very true. Yeah, and so that that as you said, that trust gets squashed, and so then bringing into question everything that you're doing is terrifying, even though you may feel that as a desire. I mean, I do. I feel that as a desire. That's my deepest desire. And yet I'm terrified of trusting it and stepping into it fully, because what if it doesn't work out? I've not been given any pointers that it'll all work out in the end. And that trust has been crushed so many times in my own life in various ways, so trusting that intuitive voice is so powerful, and it's something that we spend no time on culturally. Is nurturing that intuition in children, especially, and letting them know that that intuitive voice is the most powerful thing they have.
Wow. Well, let's back up a bit. We kind of skipped over chapter 3, and I thought for that this is where he talks about the principles of inner being. And I thought this would be a good one for us to actually just verbatim read through it a little bit, and then you can share your take on it, and I'll share mine. But I really think this is the essence of the whole book, where we're going, and so I'm just going to read this verbatim. So he has a bullet list in chapter 3. He says some of the principles of the new story are that my being partakes of your being, and that all being and that of all beings. This goes beyond interdependency. Our very existence is relational. I think there's so much in that one sentence. That I had to stop and just sit and think about that for a moment. That this idea that I exist because we are in relationship. That if I couldn't relate to you, to the people that I love, to the people that I don't know, to the nature, to the world, to the past and the future, there's so much relatedness that essentially is the crux of our existence, and we've been trained not to think that way at all. That it's just this sort of this physical collection of atoms that we are, that somehow that's our existence. But that first statement in his list of what interbeing means, I really think we could all just spend a few days contemplating it and not get to the bottom of it.
Absolutely, yeah.
And he goes on to say that therefore we do to another what we do to ourselves, which sounds a lot like the Golden Rule. I thought that was an interesting throwback to the Bible. That each of us has a unique and necessary gift to give the world. This makes me think of the desire that you were speaking of, Jeremy, because I don't think when you're talking about desire, I don't think you're talking about stuff that I want. You're not talking about I so much want a car, or I want a prettier wife, or something. I mean, it's like
that's a very different kind of desire.
And I love your wife, so I wouldn't. I was a terrible example, but the point is, this desire is really not so much to take, but to give,
right?
And that's at the core of this gift economy and his whole sacred economics point of view. That life is a gift, and therefore, the more alive we are, the more we want to give, and the more we give, the more alive we feel.
Right. Which then starts to radiate to everybody around us, and then therein lies the sort of connected dots, that begin to kind of radiate out into the culture around us. It has to. I think it has to start on an individual level. We have to first really acknowledge that these things that you're reading here, that he's pointing out, that we are interconnected. What I do to myself, I do to everybody else. So there's no difference between me and the homeless guy on the street. He is an aspect of me.
Yesterday, I was at the park for a performance that my wife was performing in, and after and when we left, as we got to the car, there was on the sidewalk somebody had dumped a can of cigarette butts. And it was just like, it was like a large soup can filled with, and there were just, 100 cigarette butts scattered around the sidewalk around it. And I looked at it, I was like, wow, that's just so ugly. And I was, getting in the car with the kids, and then I just paused, and it's like, well, should I pick it up. It's so disgusting, you know. I mean, it's like, do I really want to even touch it? And then I literally like just was still, like I couldn't move because I felt myself being pulled. Like, well, it's not my problem, but maybe it is. You know, I mean,
Right.
and nobody's going to give me credit. Maybe my kids. I did actually. I was influenced by the fact that my kids were there. It's good modeling, you know, if I go ahead and clean it up. But I was thinking, you know, anybody walking by on this sidewalk is not going to think, oh, I'm really glad that there's no cigarette butts here,
Right.
and that if there were, somebody came along and cleaned them up. So I wasn't going to get any credit for it. And I sat there, and it's like, well, we need to go home, but. And something just finally, it's probably because we're reading this book, it just sort of moved me. And I said, you know what, I'm just going to do it. And the kids were like, ooh. But so I cleaned up, and I realized now that I'm telling this story, oh, maybe I'm getting credit for it, which is that's not the point. Really, I don't think it's anything particularly special because I'm really giving myself a gift as much as anyone else who gets that to benefit from the cleaner sidewalk.
Right.
Just because of how I feel different having partaken in this interbeing. It's like I feel more connected to everyone who will walk along that sidewalk that I don't even know who they are.
Right.
So that was a kind of a profound moment just yesterday. I'm glad that happened before this, because it drives the point home of how little things that we do can really amplify our sense of interbeing.
Yeah, and then this next bullet point speaks right to that. Every act is significant and has an effect on the cosmos. So, you know, cleaning up the trash on the sidewalk is an extremely significant act, and it's no less or more significant than doing some huge, massive thing that affects thousands of people instantly. You know,
Yeah.
They're the same act, really. They're all significant.
Right.
There's no act too small, really.
Let's go on. We are fundamentally unseparate from each other, from all beings, and from the universe. I think that's implicit in the other things, but it's interesting to me that he kind of made up the word unseparate. It reminded me of unschooling, which is something you and I are both participating in.
Yeah.
But that sometimes, while we still have one foot in the old story, we have to sort of reference that as we define the new story. Unseparate.
Uh-huh. I like it.
So yes, it's not unpleasant to see you today. I feel less unconnected to you. Going on, that every person we encounter and every experience we have mirrors something in ourselves. That's big, especially when it triggers judgments.
Yeah.
You know,
That's a big one. Judging people around us. Oh, look at that person over there, and look at what they're doing. What we're really saying is, you know, look at that aspect of ourselves and that we're not paying attention to and should be doing something about, and I feel bad about. So I'm going to throw it on this other person instead.
Yeah. And there's a temptation to try to assimilate that into the old story by saying, well, therefore I should fix that other person because I'm fixing myself, and it can sort of motivate you to sort of have poor boundaries. But I don't think that's really what he's saying. Is that and throughout the book, there's many examples of Charles really demonstrating how to move beyond judgment, and how to, you know, just not see things as wrong.
Right.
And there is this sort of paradoxical thing where you say, well, you can clearly say, you know, for example, if you see another parent yelling at their child, you might say that's wrong, that's bad, I need to fix that person, I need to teach him a lesson or whatever. But but to see beyond that, and to see that that's me, yelling at that child, and rather than to judge it, to which just sort of increases the sense of separation, or to fix it, which implies the judgment, to just step in with inspiration into the new story, and bring the spirit of the new story into that situation. So yes, that man yelling at his child is me, but he's also me being compassionate toward my child, right? So there's this oneness between the two of us,
right?
That exists in the new story. And so rather than resist the old story and tell him that he's wrong or try to fix him, I can move in and just bring the spirit of the new story.
Right.
And I've done that on a few occasions where I just try to bring compassion and say things that I think will maybe remind that person that they're not just the old story, that they're the new story too, and that there's another way to see. I think it was yesterday. I'm trying to remember where it was. It was at a swimming pool. I took my kids to the swimming pool, and this this dad had like a 2-year-old, and the 2-year-old just started running away from him, running toward the water. She just wanted to jump in and play, and he started yelling at her like, don't run away, hey, but she ran to the water, into the shallow end, and she turned around and she looked at him and she was all smiling, and it's like, look at me, Daddy, I'm so much in joy. She was completely oblivious to his fear, and so I looked at, he was right next to me, and I looked at him and I said something like, I said, it looks like her joy is speaking louder than you. Something. It wasn't quite that confrontational, but that was the essence of what I was saying. Is like, you can't yell loud enough to overpower the voice of her inner joy.
Yeah, that's great.
But I managed to eke out the words. I've had some practice at this for a while, so I managed to eke out the words that didn't come out in a way that I was judging him. It was just appreciating the situation.
Right. There's a couple of more bullet points here we should probably speak to, and then do you want to get to the?
Yeah, let's go to chapter 4, and we can finish it up. So he says that humanity is meant to join fully the tribe of all life on earth, offering our uniquely human gifts toward the well-being and development of the whole. Wow, I mean, that's just thick. Yeah. It seems like an extension of what he said earlier about expressing our gifts.
Right.
But that it's part of this bigger picture.
That's what we're meant to be doing, right? But somehow we don't. Well, sometimes we do and sometimes we don't. Yeah.
And in some ways I think that we are, when you talk about the tribe of all life on earth, and the sense that, I mean, we are already giving our gift to the world. It's just the nastiest gift you can imagine. I'm not saying this right, but what I mean is that, if you look at the broader picture of, the story of humanity, and looking at this particular stage in human development as a kind of a crisis that's a part of our evolution,
right?
Then you could say that all of the evil shit we do is, part of that gift. And that could easily turn into a justification. That's certainly not what I'm suggesting. But I think at some point you need to appreciate it. Okay, I needed to explore the dark before I could really appreciate the light. And I think we do that individually, often going through personal trials,
Hmm.
or rebellion sometimes is how it expresses.
Right, right.
So there's one more point that purpose, consciousness, and intelligence are innate properties of matter and the universe. So this is something that it seems just true to me because I was kind of raised with that perspective, with the kind of a new agey,
Hmm.
metaphysical kind of way of looking at things. And I when I read that, I thought, wow, this is the point where he risks losing a big part of the readership,
Hmm.
the people who are more rational oriented people. And so, uh, not surprisingly, he moves into chapter 4 to address that.
Uh-huh.
And right off the bat in chapter 4, um, where is it? He says, I would like to speak to those of you who feel triggered by the principles of interbeing.
Uh-huh. New Age puffery.
Right. And that really spoke to me because um, I've felt sort of torn between those two worlds quite a lot.
Yeah.
I've always felt like I'm a rational person and a reasonable person, and that I'm not one of those new age kooks, who thinks that everything is caused by UFOs and whatever. Like,
Right. Right.
and so
Theorist.
and he talks all about that throughout this chapter,
Right.
um, and how all these are all just sort of looking at the truth from different angles,
Right.
and it's all an important part of human consciousness. But I've really struggled with, on the one hand, I connect very deeply with some of these metaphysical perspectives, the idea of connectedness and that spirit is in everything. Those are things that I've felt my whole life.
Hmm.
And at the same time, I really like I really like science and rationality and so I've always felt sort of this kind of schizophrenia, like the part of me that wants
Hmm.
to speak about this truth that I feel, and also the part that wants to sort of be validated by or not seen as a kook by
Right.
people that are more like, I guess, would be described as maybe scientific materialists.
Hmm. But
Um,
that's why, I think we have to sort of try to walk that middle ground between those two sort of seemingly polar opposites. Yes, they both exist, and we can have beliefs in either side there, but we have to sort of navigate in the middle if we're going to really not appear to be to one side or to the other side. You know what I mean?
yeah, but I don't like the feeling of just trying to uh, compromise or trying to, you
Oh, I think
know,
it's a compromise. I think walking in that middle ground is not really a compromise because it's contains all of it.
right.
It's not saying I'm only going to do half. I'm only going to believe half in the sort of metaphysical world and only half in the scientific world. It's like, no, I'm walking through this middle part here, where it's both this and that, and it's
Yeah,
neither this nor that, and it's all of it, and it's all there.
yeah.
And I can dip in and out of either side at any time, but walking down the middle path is seems like a good way to keep everything in balance.
Right. Well, and I guess I don't think of it as a middle so much more as an above.
Mm,
That it's a transcendent perspective. It transcends and includes both of those polar opposites,
right.
which is the terminology that I learned from Ken Wilber,
Hmm.
reading his stuff. And ironically, people who follow Ken Wilber and Ken Wilber himself are often extremely critical of the New Age. And that I think because, at least Ken Wilber is, has a spiritual perspective and a scientific perspective. He's done a brilliant job of integrating those two. But he's also very critical of certain interpretations that are more either New Agey or what would be thought of as naive or romanticized. And but I feel like it just feels wrong when I participate in those communities and there's this kind of derision toward that perspective, as if it has no validity at all. And Ken Wilber himself says nobody is smart enough to be wrong 100%. Everyone has a piece of the truth.
Right. Interesting.
So was there anything else in chapter 4 that really stuck out for you about cynicism?
Let me just quickly look at my notes here. Not really. No, I think that was my main thing, was the sort of the deeper desire of being the thing that we're most afraid of. I think Martin Luther King had some. I'm sorry, it's not Martin Luther King. It was Nelson Mandela said something about we're not. It's not our deepest fears that we're afraid of. It's the success. We're terrified of being the best that we can be.
Yeah.
Something like that. I totally butchered that, but this, he has a great quote that really sort of sums that up. The idea that we're actually more terrified of our success than we are of our failure.
I know what you're talking about. I don't remember the quote exactly, but
yeah.
I'll post it on the website.
No, good. So
there is a couple things I just want to point out from chapter 4. I just have to narrow this down because we're going to go on and on forever.
Yeah, we've gone over already.
Oh, no.
Anyone listening?
Those of you who are still listening.
Those of you who are still here, congratulations. You've survived our rambling.
Yes, and we have a special code for you. So I'll start. The thing he says at the very end, I think, is the most important. He says, one needs to be surrounded by many, many other people who themselves hold the same story, however imperfectly. Enlightenment is a group activity.
Yes, I loved that last line too. Enlightenment is a group activity.
Yeah, and that we're all going to be imperfect in how we stand in the new story.
Right.
But with enough people standing imperfectly,
you
start to get the picture of something more perfect.
Yeah, and
more
it speaks
beautiful.
directly to the whole idea of interbeingness again, and interconnectedness.
Yeah.
You can't just stand there alone and expect to, not have any support. You have to have the support of people around you in order to make any difference. I mean, it's funny because it has to start individually, but then it has to collectively be. We all have to be helping each other out.
Right. Which is why we're doing this and engaging in conversation rather than keeping it to ourselves.
Right. Yeah. Hopefully, some of what we're saying makes some sense to someone somewhere.
So we had a few viewers measure in some of their thoughts. We're really wanting to get more people. We haven't quite hit our stride yet with the participatory aspect of this podcast, but we really want people to kind of do what we've been doing, which is just share the personal impacts of how does this idea that we see in this book, how does it really describe something personal for us, and tell a little bit about your personal story. We had a few comments, so I will. Why don't you start?
Yeah, sure. So, we got a comment from Ed Levin, and this is interesting because I actually know Ed Levin.
Oh.
And he just sort of popped up on this comment, and I was like, wow, I think I know this guy. And sure enough, I do. So hey, Ed, thank you so much for putting this comment forward. and we should try to reconnect. He says, reading the beginning of the book, I realize it's time for me to move from asking what is the change necessary for global healing to looking at why the change is so difficult for us to make. The tipping point to collective critical mass is something I still hope to see in my lifetime. And that's a really interesting perspective. It's like, yeah, I think I think Ed really kind of nails it here. We've all been asking what, but why is it so difficult for us to do anything?
Right.
Collectively?
And I think he was speaking about the in chapter 4, this kind of psychological defense that we all use.
Yeah.
That cynicism is a defense against having to confront the woundedness we feel.
Right. Right. I mean, because collectively, it's like with global warming or whatever. I mean, pretty much every major scientist in the world who studied this all agree, right?
Yeah.
That we got some very serious issues to face, but why have we not made any changes? This country is one of the worst countries in the world for climate policy. Mm. Why is that? It just is baffling to me. I just don't understand. What's so difficult now? If we all know this, why can't we make some changes?
Well, shouldn't we just blame the Republicans?
Yes, that's what we'll do.
It's all their fault.
The solution right there. Just jump right back into the old story.
Yes, but I was being facetious.
Yeah, it's a good point. And then Marie Goodwin wrote in too. I also really like the idea that cynicism as a reflex is much more limiting than helpful. Things impossible from an old story are possible from a new one. And the cynic is acting from old story wounds and themes. So much more is possible if that isn't our first go-to place, but instead something we consciously recognize as self-limiting behavior.
I agree with Marie, and I've also felt like there's a bit of a catch-22 there. Mm-hmm. It's like because of the way the defense system works, you really, I mean, it's sort of like saying the way that you need to be able to move beyond the defense in order to move beyond the defense. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but
no.
I'll try. Let me try this again. In other words, so we have this, I shouldn't say we, because I feel like I don't have it as much, but most people who are cynical have this woundedness, and it is a defense against, or the cynicism is a defense against feeling it and having to face it. And so, right. That's why the cynicism is the go-to reaction. In order to not go to it, you have to sort of not be, you have to be willing to feel the pain.
Right.
And, but if you're defended against feeling it, so it's this kind of circular thing.
It's a sort of spiral pattern that people get caught in, I think, and just...
Which is why people often don't really move beyond that until they've hit bottom in some sort of way.
Right. It's like
not individually, then collectively.
Right, you got to go through the fire in order to be forged anew at the other side of it,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But who wants to do that?
Woohoo! It's a fire!
Yeah, jump on in, folks. Get burned up. Come out the other side.
Another comment comes from someone I know. Her name is Beth. Oh, it's my wife. My lovely partner, Beth, was impacted by the part of Chapter 4 in which Charles describes how cynicism is defense. Her concise conclusion: we can run, but we can't hide from our shadows. Right. I think there's no more way to say it. And like we were saying before, eventually you'll hit bottom and you can't hide anymore.
Right. That's very true. I've personally experienced that. In many different ways. No matter where I go, there I am. And I just can't escape that.
Yeah, it's funny. Have you had the experience where you sort of, you're escaping, you're trying to escape,
uh-huh.
and it's not going to work, but you just hold out as long as you can.
You just do it anyway. Yeah. How many times can I spin this same wheel? Yeah.
Right.
Maybe it'll wear out eventually.
Yeah, it's a really deeply ingrained defense that, or very collection of defenses that we all have.
Yeah.
That we'll just keep doing the same thing over and over, even though we know it's not going to work.
Right.
Because it's just sort of this desperate hope that we don't have to face the pain of the whole world, you know. But I really think when you do just stop and breathe, you get kind of a gift from the universe that you realize you don't have to carry it all.
Right.
You know, that you can face all of this pain and all of this wrongness and all of the destruction of the old story, and not and still somehow find peace in that. And I think that's that acceptance. First of all, that kind of radical acceptance is what I see Charles demonstrating throughout the book, constantly challenging us not to just go for the easy blame and just accept our so-called enemies, you know. But I think that radical acceptance is really a key to being able to get out of this catch-22.
Yeah.
And to just to surrender, really.
Right. Which comes back to the idea of trust again, you know.
Yeah.
Trusting that intuitive sense, you know, that we're all connected and we need to be operating from that place.
Right.
Swimming in the same stream.
So, well, let's talk about the next.
Yeah, there's a lot in this. You know, it's hard to limit this. There's so much even in those first 4 chapters, Scott. You know, I feel like we barely touched on it even now. So, you know, I encourage everybody to jump back in and read them again. If you haven't read those chapters, read them for the first time. And if you've read them already, then read them again. And when you've done that, read them again. Because really, there's just so much there.
Also, if there was something about any of these first 4 chapters that impacted you or that brought forward some personal insight that you have that's unique to you, or a personal story of how that idea has played out in your life, that's what we really want to share, is so that we can make this more of a collective journey as we move through the rest of the book. So what I think we'll do at the beginning of the next episode, even though we'll be moving forward to chapters 5 and beyond, but if anyone still has any personal sharing relative to the first 4 chapters, go ahead to the website. There's the link. And follow the instructions there for sharing those comments, because we really want to, we really want this to be a collective journey.
Yeah, definitely.
And at the beginning of the next video, we'll share some of those as a kind of review of chapters 1 through 4. We'll share some of those comments, if there are any, and then move on to the next chapters. And if you read ahead, of course, then please share your comments about those too. And now we need to decide how many chapters we're going to cover in the next video.
Well, four is a lot, but I think we should do 4. You know,
yeah,
and keep moving forward. There's so much in this book. There's 36 chapters to get through. So yeah, let's do another 4.
And we'll have to do if we're going to do 4 per episode. That's 9 videos we need to make. So they might come more often than every week.
Easy, Scott.
Piece of cake.
All right.
All right. So the next 4 chapters, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Are insanity, force, science, and climate. So looking at some of the practical matters that we're all concerned about.
Great. Well, I look forward to it, Scott.
Me too.
Until next time.
All right. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Jeremy. I had a lovely time with you, as always.
Likewise. Thanks a lot, Scott. We'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.